What is the lowest price ever paid for a human life? 8 cents? Less than the cost of a loaf of bread, less than the sound a coin makes when it hits the dirt. In a forgotten Georgia town, someone paid that price. And not long after, a skull was crushed under the weight of iron and hate. They said it was an accident. The machine malfunctioned. But the whispers never stopped. Who was the boy? Why was his name erased? And why did the sheriff order the records burned 3 days later? Tonight, we go back to the year 1851, to the plantation that no one dared speak of again, because the truth of what happened there was never meant to survive. Georgia, 1851. The earth was red, iron thick, and heavy with the weight of everything buried beneath it. The fields looked endless, a horizon stitched with rows of cotton that shimmered like bone in the afternoon sun. The air itself seemed alive, thick, suffocating, and filled with the slow rhythm of suffering that no one spoke of aloud. In that year, a single coin could buy a day's meal, a night's whiskey, or a child's entire existence. The world had narrowed itself to numbers, prices, and bodies, what one man could own and another could never reclaim. In the southern counties of Georgia, wealth wasn't measured in silver or land, but in the lives that labored under the whip. The cotton empire had grown monstrous, feeding cities far away that never saw the fields it destroyed. And within that machine of profit and pain, the line between human and object blurred completely. Records from that year list transactions with horrifying simplicity. 1 mule, $22. 1 wagon, $12. 1 child, 8 cents. The ink on those ledgers dried faster than the blood on the ground. No one knows exactly where the auction took place. Some say near the riverbanks of Milledgeville. Others claim a roadside clearing outside Macon. But the story always begins the same way. A small boy, thin as a shadow, barefoot, trembling beside a cart. He could not have been older than 9. His ribs showed through his skin like the frame of a broken bird. They said his mother had been sold weeks earlier, taken toward Alabama with the morning caravan, her cries fading behind the wagon wheels. By the time the trader reached Georgia, the boy had stopped speaking entirely. When asked his name, he just stared at the dirt. The auctioneer, already drunk from the sun and whiskey, tapped his ledger with impatience. Buyers weren't interested in weak stock. They wanted bodies that could pull, lift, survive the lash. This one looked like he wouldn't last the week. Someone muttered that the boy's bones were soft, his spine crooked. The trader shrugged and spat into the dust. 8 cents, he said finally, waving his hand like brushing away a fly. Take him, or I'll feed him to the river. The words fell flat, but the offer stood. 8 cents, 2 coins that clinked in the palm of a man named Thomas Hollis. He was a cotton overseer, not a rich man, but cruel enough to act like one. He'd been looking for another pair of hands to tend his new machine, a monstrous wooden press that promised to squeeze more cotton in less time. The boy didn't look strong enough to move its levers, but Hollis had his reasons. He liked control, and he liked silence. This child offered both. The deal was made in less than a minute. The coins exchanged, the ledger signed. No one bothered to ask where the boy had come from, who his parents were, what his name might be. To the crowd, it was no more remarkable than buying a sack of nails. The boy's eyes, though, those who saw them remembered. They were not blank. Like the others, not beaten into obedience. They were watchful, quiet, like he was learning the world by memorizing its cruelty. Hollis didn't bother with a wagon. He tied a length of rope around the boy's wrist and walked him down the road, toward the plantation. The sun was setting, and the sky over Georgia burned in streaks of orange and violet, the air alive with insects and the distant croak of frogs. Every few steps, Hollis would tug the rope harder, muttering something under his breath. The boy stumbled often, but never cried out. That silence unsettled Hollis more than he'd admit. The plantation itself was a sprawl of decay, rotting fences, crooked barns, and a looming wooden structure that dominated the yard. The cotton press. It looked like something half alive, its beams groaning when the wind pushed through them. Hollis had built it himself, piece by piece, claiming it would make him a wealthy man. The truth was simpler. It made him feared. The press wasn't just for cotton. It was for punishment. As the boy entered that world, the smell hit him first: iron, sweat, and the faint sweetness of rotting fruit. Other enslaved men watched from the shadows, their faces blank, their bodies moving in rhythm with the work. They saw the new arrival and turned away. Everyone learned quickly not to watch too long. The boy was sent to the shed by the press, where the nights hummed with mosquitoes and the sound of wood shifting in the dark. He slept on a pile of husks, his body curled tight as if to protect what little of himself was left. Days bled into weeks. Hollis had a temper that burned fast and without warning. He'd storm into the shed, drunk on homemade whiskey, swinging his cane at anyone too slow to answer. The boy rarely spoke, but he worked with uncanny precision. He learned how the machine breathed, how its ropes creaked when tension built, how the iron latch clicked before release, how the air shuddered right before the beam fell. To others, it was noise. To him, it was a language. Sometimes, when no one was watching, he'd trace the grooves on the wood, his small fingers moving over the stains that never washed away. He'd whisper something, maybe a name, maybe a prayer. No one ever asked. No one cared. But inside that quiet, something was building. A memory, a sound, a weight too heavy to hold forever. At night, the plantation slept under a sky thick with stars. The boy would lie awake, listening to the cicadas, to the faint grind of gears in the press shed. The machine never stopped settling, even in the dark. It creaked like it remembered. Some said the place was cursed, that the ground itself had soaked up too much pain. Hollis laughed at such talk. Machines don't remember, he'd say. But the boy knew better. Machines learned from their masters. They repeated what they were taught. In town, people whispered about Hollis, the man who'd built a contraption, strong enough to crush a full bale in one pull. They didn't talk about the screams that came from his shed, the way the lanterns burned late into the night. And no one ever mentioned the boy, though a few had seen him, thin as smoke, moving like a ghost behind the wooden beams. That's where the story begins, not with murder, not with blood, but with silence. The kind of silence that only exists before something terrible happens. The kind that hums in the bones of the earth and waits for a single sound to break it. In 1851, Georgia was full of such silences, fields heavy with secrets, rivers that swallowed too many truths. The boy had no name, no history, nothing but the memory of hands that once held him and the knowledge of the machine that loomed above. And somewhere deep inside him, beyond the hunger and the fear, was a single thought that refused to die. Even a life worth 8 cents could still break something far more valuable. They said he wasn't even supposed to survive the trip. The journey from the Carolina border to the center of Georgia took days, sometimes weeks, under a sun that burned through skin and thought alike. The traders packed the wagons tight and those too small to pull their weight walked beside them, stumbling through dust that rose high enough to choke the breath out of a child. He didn't speak, not from fear, but because his voice had worn out long before the roads turned red with clay. What words could describe what he'd already seen? The breaking of families, the sound of mothers calling names that vanished into the whip's echo. He was learning that silence could be armor. The boy's body looked brittle, as though it had been pieced together with wire and prayer. The traders saw no value in him, his wrists too thin, his spine slightly bent, a faint tremor in his hands that made it difficult to lift heavy loads. To them, he was damaged property. To Thomas Hollis, he was something else. Hollis had always taken an interest in the broken, not from pity, but from the perverse satisfaction of control. He believed fear could turn weakness into obedience, and obedience was worth more than strength. On his first morning at Hollis Farm, the boy was given no name. Slaves there weren't given names by their owners. They were given numbers. Names were personal, and personal things were dangerous. Hollis's rule was simple. You are what I say you are. The boy became number 4, a meaningless title that fit neatly on the ledger beside the others. He didn't protest. He simply bowed his head, memorizing the man's voice, the sound of the cane striking the dirt, the boots crunching gravel. Every sound meant something. Life on the plantation followed a rhythm of cruelty disguised as order. The fields awakened. Before dawn, the air thick with humidity and the smell of raw cotton. The boy worked in the press shed, his job to keep the gears oiled and the beams greased. Hollis would demonstrate the process over and over, shouting instructions that echoed against the wooden walls. "You see this?" he'd bark, slamming the lever down. "This is progress. This is how men become masters." The boy would nod, pretending to understand. But he wasn't just nodding. He was memorizing everything. The speed of the fall, the weight of the lever, the time it took for the latch to lock. The machine fascinated him. It was like a beast with bones of wood and muscles of iron, creaking and breathing under his touch. When Hollis wasn't looking, the boy would run his fingers along its frame, tracing the grooves where blood had stained and dried. He would listen to the small movements inside the structure, the faint clicks of tension, the whisper of rope against pulley. Each sound taught him something about how the press lived, how it could be made to obey or destroy. He didn't yet know why he cared, only that he did. In a world where nothing belonged to him, this strange mechanical monster felt like the only thing that listened back. Hollis treated the boy like an inconvenience, a tool too fragile to break yet too cheap to replace. When the boy faltered, he'd strike him with a cane or the flat of his palm, always with the same phrase, "I paid for you." Those 4 words carved themselves into the boy's memory deeper than any lash could. "I paid for you." They meant his life had a number, a price lower than a pig, lower even than a handful of nails. But instead of breaking him, the words settled in him like coal waiting for fire. Other slaves rarely spoke to him. They were older, worn down by years of submission, and the boy's silence unnerved them. To them, silence often meant madness. One woman, older and kind-eyed, once slipped him a piece of cornbread in the shadows of the kitchen. "Don't look at him when he yells," she whispered. "Don't look. Just keep your eyes on the ground and wait for him to tire." He nodded but didn't promise. He'd already stopped lowering his eyes. When Hollis shouted, the boy's gaze stayed fixed, cold and unblinking, like the stillness before a storm. There were nights when Hollis would sit drinking beside the press, staring at it like it held the answers to his life's failures. He'd rant to anyone who'd listen about the future, how machines would make men rich, how he'd build a second press, a bigger one. The boy, crouched in the dark corner, would listen to every word. He learned that Hollis had debts, that he'd mortgaged half his land, that the cotton press was supposed to be his redemption. But instead, it had become a curse. It jammed often, ruined bales, and required constant repair. The more it failed, the more Hollis drank. The more he drank, the more he punished the boy. Sometimes Hollis would use the press as a warning. He'd gather the field hands and show them what the machine could do, lowering the heavy beam until it crushed a bale flat. "That's what happens when you cross me," he'd say. "Machines don't care who's under them." The boy would stand in the back, his face unreadable. But inside, something stirred each time the beam dropped. A quiet understanding that one day, the same force could turn the other way. The boy didn't think in words like revenge. He thought in sounds and movements, in cause and effect. He understood how pressure built and where it released. He knew that every lever, every pin, every weight had a weakness. And he began to imagine, just faintly, what would happen if the machine obeyed him instead of its master. Rain came heavy that summer. The fields flooded and the cotton spoiled in the heat. Tempers flared. Hollis's debts grew worse, and he turned his rage inward. The boy often bore the brunt of it. One evening, after a day of endless shouting, Hollis struck him so hard the boy fell against the wooden frame of the press. Blood ran down his cheek and dripped into the gears. Hollis laughed. "You see that?" he said. "Even the machine knows your worth." Then he walked away, leaving the lantern burning. The boy didn't cry. He pressed his hand to the wood, feeling it tremble faintly beneath his fingers. He whispered something that no one heard, a sound more like breath than speech. The press creaked as if answering. It was then he understood. Machines might not have souls, but they could be taught to remember pain. Over time, he grew leaner, quieter, more deliberate. His movements became precise, almost graceful, as if he were mimicking the rhythm of the machine. Hollis didn't notice the change. He was too lost in his own spiral of drink and debt. But others saw it. One field hand said later that the boy's eyes had gone strange, too calm, too knowing, like he'd seen something in the shadows and made peace with it. He began staying in the press shed longer after dark, pretending to fix things that weren't broken. He'd study the latch, test the rope, measure the seconds between tension and release. To anyone else it would have seemed meaningless, but to him it was a language, one he was learning to speak fluently. Each creak, each pull, each groan of wood told him a secret, and by the time the summer waned and the air turned heavy with the smell of rot and rain, the boy knew the press better than the man who'd built it. No one realized what that meant, not yet. To them, he was still the weak one, the one worth 8 cents, the one who wouldn't last the season. But behind those silent eyes, the equation had already changed. In a world where everything had a price, he'd learned that some debts couldn't be paid in coins. They demanded something heavier, something that could crush a man's name flat against the earth. Thomas Hollis was not born cruel. At least, that's what his mother used to say before she stopped saying anything about him at all. In his youth, he'd been a boy of promise, quick with his sums, obsessed with machines, and fascinated by how things worked. But somewhere between the farm's inheritance and the debts he inherited with it, something inside him hardened. The years turned him from a curious boy into a bitter man, and the land around him reflected that change. Every corner of the Hollis plantation bore his frustration. Broken fences, half-finished inventions, rusted tools abandoned mid-project. Yet the one thing he finished, the one thing that truly mattered to him, was the cotton press. It was a towering structure of wood and iron, built not by hired craftsmen but by Hollis himself. He'd spent months on it, studying sketches from agricultural journals, borrowing parts from mills, and modifying them to suit his temper. The press stood at the edge of the plantation yard, a monstrous frame with heavy beams that rose like gallows. When the wind moved through it, the whole thing moaned like a dying animal. Hollis loved it. To him, it was proof that he was still a man of progress, a visionary trapped among fools. But to everyone else, it was a warning, a machine that could crush more than cotton. Hollis was known in the nearby towns as that tinkering bastard, the kind of man who'd spend his nights hammering metal instead of sleeping. His clothes always smelled of oil and whiskey, his fingers permanently blackened from soot. He'd talk to anyone who'd listen about efficiency, about how his invention would change everything. The future belongs to those who make the world. Move faster, he'd declare, slamming his hand against the bar counter. But no one wanted to hear sermons from a man who shouted more than he smiled. He treated his workers like extensions of his machine, things that existed only to feed the rhythm of production. If a person faltered, he replaced them like a broken part. He called it progress, but it was control. He believed in the perfection of systems, and for him, the human heart was just another faulty mechanism that needed breaking before it could be made useful. He'd say, "Pain sharpens a man," though everyone knew he meant everyone except himself. When he brought the 8-cent boy to the plantation, he saw an opportunity. Not for redemption or kindness. Hollis didn't believe in either, but for proof that even the weakest could be shaped into purpose. He saw the boy's frailness and felt a sick kind of satisfaction. If he could make this one obey, make him operate the great press without error, then his philosophy would stand true. To him, the boy was a test, an experiment in power. Hollis's cruelty didn't always come as shouting. Often it came disguised as lessons. He'd take the boy to the shed, force him to stand beside the machine and talk about how the world worked. Men like me build, men like you serve. That's balance. He'd run his palm across the smooth iron lever, eyes glinting. If the world ever changed places, boy, everything would fall apart. Because you people don't understand weight. You don't understand what it takes to make something move. Sometimes, when the boy's trembling hands failed to keep up, Hollis would make him hold his arms out straight until they ached. Other times he'd make him stand beside the press as it dropped, just close enough to feel the wind of it crashing. Down. He'd smile when the boy flinched. "Good," he'd say softly. "Now you're learning respect." What he didn't understand was that the boy wasn't learning respect. He was learning rhythm. Every sound, every motion of the machine, every angry breath Hollis took, became part of a pattern the boy studied silently. He saw how the master's hands trembled when he was drunk, how he always struck with his left hand first, how he leaned, his weight on the same beam when giving orders. He noticed how the machine's latch hesitated before it locked, how the chains creaked in specific places. The boy learned all this without realizing why. He was collecting pieces of a language, the only language that existed between them. To the people who worked under Hollis, he was both feared and pitied. His temper was legendary, but so was his loneliness. The house he lived in stood apart from the workers' quarters, dark and silent. His wife had died years before. Some said of fever, others whispered of something worse. Since then, no one had seen him smile unless it was followed by cruelty. He'd drink late into the night, the glow of his lantern burning through the windows, as he muttered to himself about progress, about destiny, about debts no one else understood. The machine was his companion now. He spoke to it as if it could answer him. When it jammed, he cursed it like a traitor. When it worked, he caressed its gears like a lover. One of the field hands once said, "He treats that press like it's his god," and maybe it was. It was the one thing he could command absolutely, the one thing that bent under his will without question, until the day it wouldn't. By midsummer, Hollis's debts had reached a breaking point. The bank was threatening foreclosure, and his cotton yields were lower than ever. He needed results, and the press became his obsession. He made the boy work longer hours, sometimes through the night, to squeeze out every last bale before the next inspection. Sleep became a luxury, mercy an afterthought. He'd shout until his voice cracked, calling the boy worthless, dead weight, the 8-cent mistake. But underneath all that anger was something he couldn't name: fear. The kind of fear that creeps in when a man realizes the thing he built might outlast him. The boy, with his silent eyes and mechanical precision, unnerved him. There was something too still about that child, something too knowing. Hollis would catch him watching, not with hate, but with understanding. That made his skin crawl. It made him lash out harder. The town began to whisper about him again. They said Hollis had gone mad, that he spent his nights locked in the press shed whispering to ghosts. One trader claimed he saw him digging near the back of the property, muttering about finding the perfect balance for the machine's weight. Another swore he heard a child's cry echo through the rain one night, then nothing at all. No one wanted to know the truth. In places like that, truth was expensive. Silence was cheap. The few who dared visit the plantation described it as a place without sound, no laughter, no singing, not even the chirp of crickets after sundown. The press dominated everything, its shadow stretching across the yard like a watchtower. The boy was always near it, oiling the gears, checking the ropes, eyes distant but focused. Hollis would pace around him, barking orders, but there was something in their movements that almost looked choreographed. Master and servant bound in a grim mechanical dance. The older slaves could feel it coming, even if they couldn't name it. They'd look at the boy and whisper prayers under their breath. One woman, the same who'd once given him cornbread, said later that she saw him one night standing beneath the press with his hand resting on the beam, whispering to it. He looked like he was listening, she said, like it was telling him something. That summer, storms rolled through Georgia, black and heavy, shaking the windows of every house in the county. On those nights, Hollis's lantern would burn longer than usual. The boy stayed close, moving through the rain-soaked yard to the press shed where thunder drowned out the sound of his footsteps. The machine groaned under the shifting humidity, and Hollis cursed it for its imperfections. But somewhere in that noise, in the storm, in the creak of gears, in the boy's breathing, something shifted. Hollis believed he controlled everything on that land, the fields, the weathered souls who worked them, the machine that bore his name. But control is an illusion that breaks the moment a man forgets he's mortal. And by the time the final storm came in August, Hollis had long stopped believing in consequences. He had built his kingdom on pain, and now it waited patiently to return the favor. The plantation slept beneath a blanket of heat that never lifted. Even at night, the air pressed down like a living thing, thick with the scent of iron, oil, and rot. Cicadas screamed from the trees, their droning cry blending with the low hum of the cotton press that stood at the edge of the yard. It was never completely silent, that machine. Even when still, it groaned softly, as though remembering the weight it had carried. Inside its wooden ribs, the scent of crushed fiber and rust clung to the air like something dead. It was a monument to both invention and cruelty, an altar built for a god that demanded labor instead of worship. The boy lived in its shadow, sleeping in a small lean-to beside the shed. His bed was a pile of rags and husks, but he rarely slept. The nights were too alive with noises, frogs croaking by the marsh, the slow creak of the press settling, and sometimes the low murmur of voices from the main house where Hollis drank himself into oblivion. The boy had learned to listen to everything. Every sound on that land carried meaning. The way the dogs barked told him who was coming. The pitch of the wind warned him of storms. Even the creaking of the press seemed to speak, a long, sorrowful sound that filled the dark when everything else had gone quiet. During the day, the heat turned the fields into a white haze. Cotton dust floated in the air like pollen, settling on the skin and sticking there until the sweat turned it to paste. The workers moved slowly, their backs bent, faces hidden beneath rags. From a distance, they looked like ghosts rising and falling with the rows of cotton. The boy didn't work the fields. His place was in the shed where the machine awaited. He kept it fed, oiled, and ready. It was a brutal rhythm. Load, press, release, repeat. Each thud of the beam vibrated through his bones until he no longer noticed it. The sound became his heartbeat. The shed itself was a kind of purgatory. Its walls were streaked with dark stains, the air filled with the metallic tang of blood that no one spoke about. Hollis often came there to shout, his voice echoing like thunder off the beams. When he tired of yelling, he'd test the press, dropping the beam just to hear it crash, grinning as if it pleased him. The boy always watched, silent and still. He never looked away, even when Hollis turned toward him. That unnerved the man. There was something in the boy's stare, something too calm, too detached, as though he were looking through the world rather than at it. There was a day when Hollis brought visitors from town, men in vests and hats, curious about the machine. He bragged about it at the tavern. He paraded them through the yard, shouting about efficiency and progress, about how his design would change the South. He made the boy demonstrate it. The visitors watched as the child's small hands worked the lever, the ropes straining under the press's weight. The beam came down with a crash, flattening a bundle of cotton into a perfect square. Hollis smiled, his teeth yellow and glinting in the sun. "See?" he said proudly. "Even a child can master it. That's how simple progress is." The men laughed, but not all of them. One, a quiet man with a scar across his cheek, watched the boy instead of the machine. When he spoke, his voice was low. "How much you pay for that one?" Hollis smirked, proud of the story. 8 cents. Cheapest I ever spent." The man nodded once, eyes narrowing. Later, as he left, he muttered to another, "That boy's got the devil's patience. Mark me, something bad's coming." The environment around them seemed to agree. That summer, the rains came too early, turning the fields into a swamp of mud and drowned roots. Cotton spoiled in the bales, souring in the heat. The slaves whispered that God had cursed the land, that the earth was finally rejecting its burden. Hollis laughed at them, shouting that storms were just weather, not warnings. But even he began to feel the shift. The nights grew darker, the frogs quieter, the air stiller. The plantation seemed to be holding its breath. The boy noticed it most, in the machine. The wood swelled with moisture, the ropes squeaked differently. He learned how the rain changed the weight of the lever, how the latch hesitated before catching. He'd tested in secret, hands steady despite the storm winds outside. Each small adjustment made the press more unpredictable, more alive. He wasn't trying to break it, not yet, but he understood how easily it could turn from tool to weapon. He didn't think of it that way in words. It was a feeling, like the way thunder builds before it breaks. Hollis's moods grew worse as the weather did. He drank more, ate less, his temper flickering between silence and rage. Sometimes he'd storm into the shed late at night, lantern in hand, shouting about thieves and traitors. The boy would stand still while the man circled him, the smell of liquor sharp in the air. Once, Hollis knocked over a can of oil, spilling it across the floor. The boy reached to clean it, but Hollis kicked him hard in the ribs, snarling, "Don't touch what's mine." Then he grabbed the lantern, tipped it, and for a moment the flame caught the oil. A streak of fire flashed across the floor before Hollis stomped it out, laughing breathlessly. "See what happens when you forget your place." The boy didn't flinch. He just watched the flame die and the smoke rise. The next morning he scrubbed the blackened boards clean, but a thin mark remained, a scar on the floor beneath the machine. He stared at it for a long time, running his fingers over the burned wood. He whispered to it, almost tenderly, as if sharing a secret. Days passed without change. Work resumed, the press groaning and thudding as always, but the others began to notice how the boy moved differently now. He no longer avoided the machine's shadow. He walked in sync with it, his steps matching the rhythm of its descent. One of the field hands whispered to another, "He's become part of it." The other man shook his head. "No, the machine's become part of him." At night, lightning flickered on the horizon, throwing white flashes across the landscape. The trees bent under the wind, their branches clawing at the sky. In those moments, the press shed seemed to breathe. The wood expanded and contracted, the ropes groaning like strained lungs. The boy would lie awake, eyes open, listening. He could feel something gathering, something vast and inevitable. Then came the night of the storm. The clouds rolled in fast, black and heavy, swallowing the moon. Rain struck the roof like stones. The dogs howled, chained beneath the porch, and the workers huddled in their cabins, whispering prayers. But in the shed, the lantern still burned. Hollis had gone out again, drunk and angry, muttering about a missing pocket knife, about thieves in his house. The boy heard his boots before. He saw him, the sharp, staggering rhythm of fury. The door slammed open, wind bursting through behind him. The lantern light danced wildly across the walls. Hollis shouted words the rain almost drowned out. He grabbed the boy by the arm, shaking him hard enough to leave bruises. The boy didn't resist. His eyes, those still, glass-dark eyes, met Hollis's. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to hold still. Then the boy glanced, just once, at the lever of the machine. No one knows exactly what happened next. The thunder cracked, the light flickered, and then came the sound, the unmistakable crash of the press falling. Some said it was the storm that made it drop. That lightning struck somewhere close and loosened the ropes. Others whispered that the boy had moved faster than the eye could see, that his small hands had pulled the lever at the perfect moment. When the overseers arrived, the machine was still moving slightly, the beam pressed deep into the floor. The rain poured through the broken roof, washing mud into the shed, carrying away the blood. The boy was gone. Only his shadow remained, etched faintly against the wall by the lantern's dying flame. When the morning came, the sky was the color of ash, and the plantation was silent in a way that didn't feel natural. The storm had passed, but it had taken something with it, something human. The overseers moved through the yard with their hats in their hands, faces pale beneath the grime. The shed stood at the far edge of the field, its door hanging crooked, one hinge snapped clean. Inside, the air still smelled of metal and rain. The cotton press sat frozen in place, the beam sunk low, and beneath it, what remained of Hollis was barely recognizable. His skull had been crushed flat, the blood dried black in streaks that led toward the door, as though something had crawled or been dragged. The body was removed quickly, but no one wanted to touch the machine. They covered it with a tarp and nailed the shed shut. For the rest of that day, The house was filled with the sound of whispered questions. The white men argued in low voices, each trying to piece together how such a thing could have happened. One insisted it was an accident, lightning maybe, or a rope snapping from where. Another swore he'd seen a figure running across the field just before dawn, small and quick, heading toward the swamps. No one wanted to admit what everyone feared, that the boy, the 8-cent child Hollis had bought like a tool, had done it on purpose. By noon, riders were sent out to search. The land around the plantation was wild, swamp and cypress and dark pools where no one dared step after sunset. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to the muddy floor of the shed, but they refused to go near the press. They whined and pulled back, tails tucked, eyes wide with the same kind of fear animals get before storms or earthquakes. The men cursed and beat them, but the dogs only howled louder, their cries echoing through the flatland like sirens of something sacred being disturbed. When they finally set them loose, the hounds followed a trail through the reeds and into the low country. The riders followed, rifles ready, the sun heavy on their backs. They found pieces of evidence, footprints too small to belong to a grown man, bits of cloth caught on branches, but the path led deeper into the swamp until even the horses refused to go on. One of the men claimed he saw the boy standing at the edge of the water, knee-deep in the reeds, watching them. He said the child didn't move or speak, just stared, the same empty calm he'd had back at the shed. The man blinked, and he was gone. The water rippled once and then stilled. By evening, the search was called off. Hollis's widow, a frail woman who rarely left her room, ordered the house shuttered. She claimed the devil himself had taken residence in that child, that Hollis had brought the curse upon himself by boasting about his cruelty. "He bought a soul for 8 cents, she whispered to one of the servants, and the Lord came to collect his due. Her words spread like fever. Soon even the overseers refused to stay after dark. The workers prayed aloud, drawing crosses in the dirt, whispering the boy's name only once before spitting into the dust to ward off his ghost. Days turned to weeks, and still no one found him. But the land began to change. The fields grew strange, patches of cotton rotting before they could be harvested. The well water tasted of rust. At night, the press, though nailed shut and untouched, was heard groaning softly, as though someone were still working it. One of the new hands swore he saw movement in the window of the shed, a figure bent over the lever. When he went to look, the door was still nailed closed and the lock was rusted from the inside. Rumors spread beyond the plantation. The nearby town began to whisper about the 8-cent boy. Some said he had drowned in the swamp and his spirit was still wandering. Others believed he'd made it north, hiding among travelers or stealing his way onto a riverboat. But the more superstitious claimed he was neither dead nor alive, that the machine had fused him to its iron heart, and he now walked wherever injustice festered, guided by the sound of grinding metal and distant thunder. The sheriff came once to take a statement, but he didn't stay long. He looked at the press, at the dark stain that no one could wash away, and shook his head. "Some things," he said, "ain't meant for justice. They just balance themselves." After that, no lawman returned. By the next season, the Hollis plantation had begun to fall apart. The widow sold off what she could and moved to Savannah, claiming the house made her sick. The new owners tried to restore it, but workers refused to go near the shed. They said the walls bled when it rained, that if you listened long enough, you could hear small footsteps in the rafters. A carpenter who was hired to dismantle the press quit halfway through, saying the ropes were warm to the touch, as if something still breathed beneath them. Years later, when the Civil War tore through Georgia, the plantation was abandoned altogether. Soldiers passing through found the shed still standing, the machine untouched. One of them, a young Union scout, wrote in his journal that he'd heard the sound of the press moving in the night, slow and deliberate, even though no wind stirred. He described finding a small handprint on the inside of the door, too fresh to be old. His last entry read, "The machine is alive. I can feel it watching me." The journal was found years later among the ruins, the pages warped by moisture and time. Historians who study the case today can't agree on the truth. Some say the boy was a symbol, a legend born from guilt, a way for people to make sense of cruelty they couldn't admit to. Others believe there was something more literal, that the story of his escape and vengeance spread because it touched a nerve buried deep in the Southern psyche. The idea that someone so small, so dismissed, could destroy the man who owned him was unthinkable and therefore unforgettable. But those who visited what remains of the plantation tell a different story. They say the land itself feels wrong, the air is too still, the birds too quiet. The shed is gone now, collapsed into the earth, but sometimes, when the wind moves through the cypress trees, it carries a low groan, like the sound of a press beam falling. A few visitors have claimed to see movement in the fog, a boy's silhouette standing ankle-deep in the water, watching silently before fading into the mist. Local elders still refuse to speak his name, fearing to summon him. They say his spirit doesn't rest, not because of revenge or hatred, but because the world never learned his story. He was born into silence, lived in shadows, and even in death was treated as a rumor. Yet his act, whether born of accident, rage, or divine justice, shattered something in the old order. The moment that press fell, it wasn't just Hollis who died. It was the illusion of ownership itself, the idea that a man could put a price on another's soul. And so in whispers that move through the marsh and the cotton fields, his name still lingers, the 8-cent boy who crushed the weight of a world that thought him worthless. Those who hear his story never forget it, though. Few dare to tell it aloud. They just listen, when the night is thick and the wind turns strange, for the faint rhythmic sound of wood and iron meeting, steady, measured, unrelenting, like a heartbeat that refuses to die. Decades passed, but the name of the Hollis plantation still carried a strange silence. People avoided speaking of it openly, yet its story traveled farther than any of them expected. By the late 1800s, after the war and the slow crumbling of the South's empire, the plantation had become a ruin swallowed by vines and mud. Nature had taken back what greed once claimed. Trees grew through the roof beams, their roots splitting the foundation. The air smelled of iron and earth, and in the deepest part of the swamp, where the old cotton press once stood, travelers said the ground still whispered. One such traveler, a young man named Elias Ward, came from Savannah in 1889. He was a writer, a collector of stories, particularly those that blurred the line between truth and superstition. He had heard the tale of the 8-cent boy from a dock worker who claimed his grandfather had known the overseer who found Hollis's body. Elias thought it sounded like a fable, a ghost story to ease the conscience of men who once owned others. But there was something about the way the dock worker spoke, something in the quiet fear behind his eyes, that made Elias curious. He decided to find the place himself. When he arrived, the path was nearly gone, swallowed by swamp and weeds. The remains of the Hollis house leaned sideways, its windows empty sockets staring into the trees. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, but beneath it was something else, a faint metallic tang that lingered on the tongue, like the taste of pennies. The silence was almost complete. No birds, no frogs, not even the buzz of insects. It was as if sound itself refused to live there. He spent his first night camped near the ruins. The moon hung low, the light breaking through the moss in streaks. Elias sat by the fire, reading from his notebook. He wrote, "There's a quiet here that feels alive. The air hums like breath held too long." As he wrote, the fire flickered. The ground beneath him gave a small, rhythmic tremor, soft, steady, almost like the sound of something pressing and releasing. He told himself it was his imagination, but the noise didn't stop. It came again, from somewhere deep within the ruins, a low creaking sigh of wood against metal. He rose and followed it, his lantern casting trembling light on the path ahead. The sound led him toward what remained of the press shed. Most of it had collapsed, buried under moss and mud. But when he brushed aside the vines, he saw it, the top beam of the cotton press, blackened and half-buried, yet unmistakably whole. The ropes were long gone, but the wood was still solid. As he knelt to examine it, He felt warmth radiating from the timber, faint but undeniable. He jerked his hand back. The air smelled of rain, though the sky was clear. That night, he dreamed of a small boy standing beside the press, watching him silently. In the dream, the boy's face was obscured by shadow, but his eyes glinted faintly, catching the firelight like glass. Elias tried to speak, but his throat felt tight, his voice trapped somewhere behind his ribs. The boy raised one hand and pointed toward the broken beam, and the wood began to move, slowly, impossibly, rising and falling in a rhythm that matched a heartbeat. Then, a voice, soft and clear, not from the boy but from the walls themselves, whispered, 8 cents. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the air cold and still. His notebook lay open beside him, the page smeared as though someone had traced a wet finger across the words. He packed his things quickly, telling himself it was nonsense, that dreams meant nothing. But when he looked back one last time, he saw something that froze him in place. A single child's footprint in the mud, small, bare, and fresh. Elias returned to Savannah within days, claiming sickness, though those who saw him said he looked more haunted than ill. He wrote one article about his visit, a short, uneasy piece titled, "The Press That Still Breathes." It was published in a small southern gazette and dismissed as Gothic fancy. But in private, Elias kept a different set of notes, filled with strange details. How the air near the press grew heavier at dusk, how the sound of distant thunder always seemed to come from beneath the ground rather than the sky. He died 10 years later, his final journal entry reading only, "He wasn't a ghost. He was something else, something older than vengeance." The story faded again, passing from memory to myth. Locals came to call the land the Boy's Acre, and no one farmed it. Even the bravest hunters avoided it. Yet sometimes, wanderers would report strange phenomena, sounds of hammering or pressing that seemed to echo from the earth itself. In 1912, a group of railway surveyors mapping a new line through the region stopped near the old plantation site. One of them, a man named Carter, described hearing the grinding of an unseen machine, while the others slept. When he investigated, he found a half-buried iron pulley wheel, fused with wood that hadn't rotted despite decades underground. The next morning, his hands were stained red, though he swore he hadn't touched anything sharp. During the 1930s, an amateur historian from Atlanta named Josephine Clark began collecting folklore about the Old South. She spent months traveling through Georgia, interviewing descendants of slaves and planters alike. When she reached the Hollis site, she found nothing but marsh and silence. Yet one elderly woman living nearby told her a story that would become the heart of Josephine's unpublished manuscript, The Weight of 8. The woman claimed her grandmother had once seen the boy after the storm, alive, thin as a branch, walking barefoot along the riverbank. He had no shadow, she said, and the water refused to touch his feet. He wasn't running from the past, the woman whispered. He was walking it forward. Josephine's notes hinted at something uncanny, that the legend of the 8 cento boy had become a kind of warning that followed injustice wherever it took root. After her visit, she began to notice a pattern in her research. In every county where particularly cruel masters had ruled, there were stories of mechanical sounds, at night of pressing, grinding, and rhythmic groans beneath the soil. She theorized that the machine was a symbol of guilt, replaying the same act over and over, an echo that the land itself could not forget. She disappeared in 1939. Her car was found abandoned near the same stretch of swamp where Hollis's plantation once stood. Inside was her notebook, open to a single sentence. "I heard it move. Today the site of the plantation lies deep within a wildlife reserve. Trees have grown thick over the old foundations, and the ground is soft and treacherous. Yet every few years, a hiker or researcher reports strange phenomena, vibrations underfoot, sounds of wood creaking where no wind blows, and once, a voice faintly repeating, 8 cents, as though the land itself remembers the cost." Modern. Investigators have tried to explain it away: shifting groundwater, decaying timber, the resonance of wind through hollow roots. But those who've gone there at night describe a different feeling, a sense of presence, of unseen eyes watching from the dark, patient and ancient. Some believe the boy's story isn't about vengeance at all. They say it's about a balance. The world keeps trying to reset. That in places where cruelty is buried but never repented, something old awakens to remind us of the weight of what we've done. That maybe the press never stopped moving because the world never stopped pressing down on the innocent. And so, when storms roll over Georgia and the thunder comes slow and deep, the people nearby still pause to listen. Somewhere, beneath the layers of soil and history, there's a sound that doesn't belong to nature. A low, steady pulse. The sound of the press falling again, and the reminder that no chain, no price, no cruelty ever truly disappears. It just waits, in the dark, for the right moment to return. There are places in the world where history does not rest. It sinks instead, like a body weighted beneath black water, motionless for a time, until the current stirs and something ancient begins to rise. The ruins of the Hollis plantation are one of those places. The trees there grow in unnatural shapes, their roots coiling around the stones of what used to be the foundation. The air hums faintly, and those who walk through the swamp claim the silence feels charged, like standing inside a held breath. Locals still avoid the place, though they rarely admit why. They say it's haunted, but not by ghosts. What lives there, they whisper, is the memory of something that refused to die. In 1962, a historian named Dr. Leonard Haynes came across a letter written by Josephine Clark, the same woman who vanished in 1939. The letter was found sealed inside one of her books, donated to a library in Macon. It was addressed to no one, but inside her handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "It's not a story," she wrote, "it's an echo." The machine was only the beginning, the sound of something remembering what was done. Haynes, skeptical but intrigued, decided to investigate the story himself. When he arrived in that part of Georgia, he found few willing to talk. The elderly residents changed the subject when he mentioned Hollis. One man finally spoke, though only after several drinks. He said that sometimes, after a heavy rain, the earth by the river swelled and split, and strange things surfaced. Pieces of rotted rope, iron hooks, a splinter of wood carved smooth by long use. "That's the old press rising," the man whispered. "The land keeps pushing it up, like it don't want it buried." Haynes dismissed the superstition, but as he spent time there, the rational explanations began to thin. His nights were restless. He recorded in his notes that he would hear rhythmic thuds in the distance, far too even to be wind or animal. He once followed the sound into the trees until it stopped, leaving him alone in a clearing filled with fog so thick he could barely see his hands. When he turned back, he realized he'd been walking in circles, the prints of his boots crossing themselves in the mud. That night he dreamed of a boy sitting beside a machine, whispering something he couldn't quite hear. By his third week, the historian was no longer certain what was real. His recordings began to pick up sounds even when he wasn't present. Faint groans of wood, the soft drag of chains, and once, a single whisper so quiet it barely registered on tape. When amplified, it sounded like a voice saying, "It's still turning." He left the next morning, pale and hollow-eyed, never publishing his findings. His journals, found years later, ended abruptly with one final line. "The ground remembers, more than men do." Time continued to move, but the story never vanished. It reappeared in fragments, in local newspapers, in college ghost tours, in the whispered folklore of Georgia's low country. By the 1990s, thrill seekers began trespassing into the swamp, carrying cameras and flashlights. Most left disappointed, finding nothing but mud and tangled vines. But a few returned shaken. They spoke of hearing something under the earth, like the slow creak of a gear turning. One man swore he saw movement in the fog, a figure the size of a child, watching from the tree line, motionless as a carving. His video footage, later released online, showed nothing but static, except for one frame where the screen flickered, and a faint sound like a heartbeat pulsed through the noise. The legend began to shift again. It was no longer about a slave, boy, or a machine, or vengeance. It became a story about echoes, about how violence never fades, only changes form. Some claimed that the machine was a metaphor, an invisible engine powered by every act of cruelty that had gone unacknowledged. Others swore the sound was real, that deep below the swamp, the remains of the press still moved, grinding endlessly. In 2015, a small team of documentarians decided to make a film about the legend. They spent 3 nights near the site, interviewing locals and filming the ruins. On the 3rd night, their audio equipment began malfunctioning. Every recording, no matter where it was taken, carried the same background rhythm, a slow, steady thud, 12 beats per minute. They thought it was a technical issue until one of them realized the sound persisted even when the microphones were unplugged. The footage was never released. When questioned, the producer only said, "We brought something back with us." To this day, the Hollis land remains off-limits, declared environmentally unstable due to flooding and erosion. But locals know the real reason. They say the swamp is alive. It breathes when no wind blows. It remembers when people forget. And if you stand quietly enough, you can still hear that same distant sound. Wood on iron, pressing, releasing, pressing again. What makes the story endure isn't just the horror of what happened, it's the truth buried beneath it. A boy, bought for 8 cents, became a symbol of everything the South tried to erase. His act wasn't just rebellion. It was a fracture in the illusion that some lives were worth more than others. The sound of the press wasn't just mechanical, it was historical, a rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat of an entire system built on suffering. And when it stopped for that brief moment, something in the world shifted. Some scholars now call it the Hollis resonance, a cultural echo that appears in different eras whenever the buried past begins to stir. In times of unrest, stories of the 8-cent boy resurface, sometimes in books, sometimes in whispered warnings. He becomes less a ghost and more a symbol of the reckoning that history always demands. Every injustice, they say, leaves a frequency behind, vibrating through time until someone listens. The people who live near the swamp today still feel it. They avoid that part of the woods, especially at dusk, when the mist thickens and the light turns gold. Hunters say their dogs refuse to cross the line where the plantation once began. Children dare each other to go near the old fence posts that mark its border. None stay long. They return pale and quiet, saying they heard something moving just beyond sight, a pulse that grew louder the longer they stood still. Sometimes, after a heavy storm, when lightning splits the sky, locals say the ground there glows faintly, as though something beneath the soil is burning. No one digs. No one wants to know what lies underneath. The swamp has become a memorial, not by intention, but by fear. The people who live closest to it speak with reverence, calling it the land that remembers. They say it isn't haunted in the way stories tell. It's aware, awake, and waiting. And when the wind changes and the frogs fall silent, they say you can almost hear him. The boy who cost 8 cents, walking somewhere beyond the fog, small. Feet pressing into the wet earth, the sound of each step echoing like the slow drop of a hammer. Not as revenge, not as warning, but as remembrance. Because history, no matter how deeply it's buried, always finds a way to press back. If you've made it this far, take a moment to breathe. Because what you've just heard isn't just a story buried in the past. It's a wound carved into the foundations of history itself. The tale of the 8-cent slave boy isn't only about one act of defiance. It's about the price of being human in a world that treated humanity like property. Every whisper from those forgotten fields, every record hidden in courthouse basements, reminds us that silence protects no one, and truth, no matter how brutal, demands to be told. If stories like this shake something inside you, that quiet awareness that history still lives within the bones of the present, then this channel is where you belong. Here we uncover what others chose to erase. We explore the dark corners of the past, the secrets history tried to bury, and the voices that refused to die. So before you go, take a second to subscribe, not just for the stories, but for the truth behind them. And when when you do, leave a comment below. Tell me what you felt, what you believe happened, or what truth you think still hides beneath this story. Because every comment you leave doesn't just help this channel grow. It keeps the conversation alive. It keeps their memory alive. And together, we make sure that history never gets the last word. We do.